Okay, let's unpack this. Welcome to the Deep Dive.
Hello.
Today, we're diving into a really fascinating source, the transcript of an interview with a man named Avraham Shapira. He shares his experience of spending 5 months in administrative detention by Israel's security agency, the Shin Bet.
Yeah, and our mission with this deep dive is to go beyond just, the story of his detention itself. We want to try and understand his specific perspective on why this happened.
Right.
Explore his really detailed critique of the security establishment, particularly the Shin Bet, and maybe see what his experience and viewpoint can reveal about a specific segment within the settler community he comes from.
Exactly. This isn't just about one person's time in prison, though
Yeah.
it's obviously central.
Yeah.
Get ready to explore some pretty intense claims about the inner workings of a major state agency, how the legal system can operate in these specific contexts.
And a really distinct definition of national identity and conflict. It's quite something.
It really is. All of it seen through the eyes of someone who claims to have lived it firsthand.
So where do we start? I think right at the beginning makes sense. The moment he describes being arrested, the scene he sets is pretty striking.
Yeah, he says it was 4 a.m., dark, quiet. He was leaving his community in Yitzhar, which, is a settlement known for its strong ideological stance up in Samaria, heading out for a day of filming, apparently.
And he recounts being stopped by border police, just a simple request for his name at first. And then he says, out of nowhere, suddenly there's this huge convoy, 7 or 8 vehicles, he estimates.
Yeah, not just regular police, but border police and Shin Bet personnel arriving on the scene.
Yeah.
Big operation.
And he highlights a detail that seems really significant to him. The officers and the Shin Bet personnel were masked.
Which immediately made him think this is not normal.
Yeah.
That's his quote.
Yeah, and then a Shin Bet officer spoke directly to him, saying something he clearly remembers. Shapira, this is not a joke. This is the Shin Bet. It's serious. That's intense. It certainly sets a tone, doesn't it? He notes this was his very first arrest. He was almost 30 years old, and they handcuffed him, hands and feet.
And he makes this claim, which is interesting, that the Shin Bet knew his exact plan.
Right. They knew he'd be leaving at 4 a.m. for filming, he says, and even knew about the film equipment he had with him, that level of detail.
He really emphasizes that he was given absolutely no information at the time of the arrest. Zero. He says he didn't know where I was going or why.
And he was taken to what he believes was a police station or maybe Shin Bet offices near Ma'al Adumim, another significant settlement area. Okay, so once he was taken in, he describes the initial interrogation process.
How did that go, according to you?
Well, according to his account, it happened really fast. Within 20 to 30 minutes, he was being bombarded with questions.
About what?
He says they were throwing dates and events at him really rapidly, asking about countless events in countless villages he was supposedly involved in. Just rapid fire.
And his interpretation of this rapid fire questioning is, I think, a key part of his critique, isn't it?
Totally. He claims it wasn't actually about getting answers from him. He felt, that they were just rushing to gather material to fill the file for the administrative detention order that he was told would be signed that very evening by the Minister of Defense.
He describes it pretty cynically, saying they were just doing it to mark V for protocol, basically.
Yeah.
That they didn't genuinely want to hear his responses or explanations for these alleged events.
Exactly. And after that intense, but in his view, sort of performative interrogation, he describes a long period of wait, just sitting there.
And this is when he says he started to realize something was off, right? Because he wouldn't be brought before a judge within the standard 24 hours required for a normal criminal arrest in Israel.
Right. That signaled to him that something strange was going on. His word.
And eventually, he says, he was informed it was administrative detention. But here's a detail he stresses throughout the interview, something he finds deeply problematic. He claims he was never told the specific reason for his arrest. Not then. Not during the 5 months. Not even after he was released. He says straightforwardly, he didn't really know why I was arrested.
Which is, a core element of the criticism around administrative detention, generally the lack of specific charges or disclosed evidence.
So that moves us to the process of administrative detention itself, as he experienced the court review. How does he describe what happens in court when these orders are challenged, or supposed to be challenged?
He doesn't paint a very flattering picture. He characterizes the entire court process for reviewing these orders as basically a technical discussion. He even goes so far as to call it a complete show.
A complete show. Wow. What makes him say that? What specific things does he point to?
Well, he really highlights the role of the Shin Bet representative in these court sessions. He says this representative sits behind a screen deliberately.
You can't see them.
Right. Unable to be seen or questioned directly. He claims they are not allowed to be seen by the defense. And critically, he asserts they simply don't answer any questions posed by the lawyers at all.
So he's painting a picture of like a total lack of transparency or any meaningful due process, at least from his perspective.
Yeah, exactly. Lawyers trying to understand the basis for the detention are apparently met with silence, or just told questions cannot be answered.
And he mentions these folders, right?
Yeah.
Presented to the judge containing information the defense isn't allowed to see.
Yeah, he makes this almost darkly humorous comment about it, saying, I don't know what's written in the holders. Maybe it says Dear Bella Cohen, just to emphasize how completely opaque it felt to him. Like anything could be in there.
Right. So based on this experience, what's his view of the judge's role in these hearings?
He sees it as extremely limited. The judge is, in his view, simply checking the legality of the order itself. Like, is the paperwork right? And deciding if there's some kind of case from the Shin Bet's perspective.
So essentially rubber stamping the order, as he puts it.
That's his argument. He claims there's no process for the judge to actually review the evidence, whatever it might be, or allow the defense to present counter-arguments or challenge the claims. He says, flatly, no such thing as cross-examination, clarification of claims, or evidence exists in this setting.
That sounds like a really, really harsh assessment of the judicial review process.
It is. His conclusion on this system is stark. He says, quote, every criminal process every legal process does not exist here at all.
Wow.
And he makes the serious claim that this system allows the Shin Bet and security forces to arrest anyone simply based on their thought and will, with the Minister of Defense and judges acting merely as rubber stamps.
He even notes his observation that the Minister of Defense at the time, Benny Gantz, apparently set a record for administrative detentions of Jews.
Yeah, he mentions that. This perspective certainly highlights key criticisms often leveled against administrative detention systems globally. The tension between security needs and individual rights, especially the right to know the case against you and challenge evidence.
Okay, so this detailed critique of the detention process leads us to the big question. Why does he believe he and others from his community are targeted in this specific way? He offers a central claim about who the enemy is perceived to be, right?
He does, and he makes a really interesting distinction here. It's quite nuanced. He believes the security establishment, especially the Shin Bet, or Shabak as he also calls it, has defined him and his friends.
Meaning the settler community, especially the Hilltop Youth.
Exactly, that younger, often more ideologically driven group living in smaller, sometimes unauthorized outposts. He says the Shin Bet sees them as the enemy, but he clarifies, this is crucial to his argument, not necessarily the enemy of the state of Israel itself, which he feels loyal to,
right,
but the enemy of the state's security system, like the apparatus itself.
Okay, so he sees the security apparatus as having its own agenda that somehow conflicts with his community's vision. What's his reasoning for that?
He explains his reasoning like this. He believes he and his community represent a specific vision for Israel. It's focused on a Jewish state, the full land of Israel for the people of Israel, Jewish settlement everywhere, the significance of the Temple Mount, Torah, God in the land, that whole package.
And he claims this vision clashes directly with what he sees as the security establishment's agenda.
Yes, which, in his view, includes working towards establishing a Palestinian state. He sees these two things as fundamentally incompatible and thinks the Shin Bet prioritizes the latter.
That's a significant claim about the Shin Bet's alleged motivation, basically accusing them of pursuing a political goal under the guise of security.
It is, and he highlights what he sees as a painful contradiction in this. He points out that members of his community serve in the military. Some have died in combat, including recently after October 7th. Yet he argues they are still paradoxically viewed as adversaries by the security system itself. That disconnect really bothers him.
And he doesn't hold back in his judgment of figures like the Minister of Defense who signed these detention orders, does he?
Not at all. He views them as pitiful and coward. His reasoning is that, in his interpretation, they are empowering Arabs or perceived enemies instead of empowering the settler community, which he sees as loyal and essential to Israel's future.
Now let's talk about the term violence. It's often used by outside observers and sometimes internally to describe actions associated with the community he represents, particularly the Hilltop Youth. He addresses this head-on in the interview, but offers a completely different frame for it.
Yeah, he pushes back hard against that term. He sees violence as a crude word, basically just a negative label used to frame what he calls the courage, spirit, and strength that the settler community uses to repel its enemies.
So he's essentially reframing actions that might be labeled as violence, like confrontations with Palestinians or property damage as necessary strength, or even a form of defense.
Pretty much. And he argues this strength and willingness to act is actually very healthy. He even claims it's fundamentally no different from soldiers fighting in places like Gaza. It's the same spirit, just a different context in his.
And he explains his belief that settlers, particularly the Hilltop Youth, take these actions because they feel the formal security system, the army, the police, does not act well enough or isn't properly fulfilling its role.
Right. He says simply, the system doesn't do its job in protecting them, or, maybe more accurately, in advancing their vision of Jewish control over the land.
And in his view, why doesn't the system do its job?
Because, he claims, the security establishment mistakenly sees Arabs in Judea and Samaria as the potential solution to the conflict, or at least partners to manage it.
While seeing settlers as the problem.
Exactly. Believing, he says, that removing settlers or restricting them would somehow bring...
But he strongly counters this, right? He flips it completely.
He does. He presents his view that the Hilltop Youth and the broader settler community are, in fact, the solution. He sees them as embodying a necessary strength, being freed from all the things we as a people are bogged down with.
What does he mean by that?
He seems to mean things like, bureaucratic restrictions, maybe fear of international opinion, legal constraints, things like that. He feels his community wants to live as proud Jews without limitations, without fences, asserting their presence.
And he even cites a specific physical example to back this up, doesn't he? The fences around.
Yeah, he points to fences being built around his community in Yitzhar, while he claims surrounding Arab villages do not have. He presents this as evidence that the settlers themselves are forced to create deterrence because the system doesn't adequately provide it. It's a direct link he makes between his critique of the system's alleged inaction and his justification for his community's own act. He also discusses a perceived divide, maybe ideological, maybe practical, within the settlement movement itself. He compares the approach of his community, the Hilltop Youth, to that of the broader, more established settlement leaders.
And he even mentions his father's role in the Yisha Council, the main umbrella group for West Bank settlements, suggesting this difference is something he's very familiar with, maybe grew up with.
Right. It sounds like he acknowledges the work of the establishment leadership. He doesn't dismiss it. He says they do holy work in building the settlements, the physical infrastructure, the communities.
Okay, so he respects that, but where does he see the key difference?
The key difference, as he perceives it, is in the focus. While the broader movement focused on physical expansion, building upward homes, institutions, communities, his community, he says, focuses on shaping content.
Shaping content. What does that mean in practice?
What he seems to mean by that is defining the nature of the relationship with the enemy, as he puts it, emphasizing things like using only Jewish labor, actively removing fences, which sounds both metaphorical and perhaps literal, expanding into open spaces beyond the established settlement boundaries, creating new, smaller outposts, and crucially, maintaining a philosophical stance of not being afraid of the system. That seems central.
And this difference, particularly that last point about not being afraid of the system, leads to a really sharp contrast in how they relate to the Shin Bet, right?
Absolutely. He claims the establishment leadership tends to cooperate with the Shin Bet, maybe tries to work within this, while his community actively refuses, states it very emphatically, the Shabak doesn't manage our lives.
And he argues that the Shin Bet, or Shabak, is actually the most dangerous and powerful body in Israel. That's a strong claim.
Yeah, he claims it disproportionately drives national policy, often, in his view, with disastrous results. He points to the Oslo Accords in the 90s and the disengagement from Gush Katif and Gaza in 2005 as major historical disasters that were significantly influenced or even driven by the Shin Bet's approach and recommendations.
And he suggests there's a deeply personal and historical root for his own profound distrust of the system. He talks about Amona.
Yes. He recounts witnessing the violent evacuation of the Amona outpost back in 2006 when he was just 11 years old. He uses really strong language, unfathomable cruelty, a rampage by state forces against settlers. He says it left a lasting traumatic impression on him about how the state system could act against his own community.
It's clear how formative that event was for him. He adds that his first documentary film was actually about the Amona evacuation.
Right, suggesting this experience wasn't just passively witnessed, but something he felt compelled to process and articulate, giving a voice to that trauma for his family and community.
So considering that deep historical distrust and his really critical view of the Shin Bet's negative influence, he raises the possibility, or maybe speculates, that his administrative detention wasn't just random.
Yeah, he kind of wonders aloud if it might have been related to his recent documentary film, the one titled The Shabak Knew, which was itself a critical look at the agent.
Does he say it was related?
No, he states explicitly he doesn't know for sure, but he notes that dealing with this film, promoting it, thinking about it, was something he was intensely focused on right before his arrest. The timing felt significant.
It certainly aligns with his overall narrative about being targeted for his views and actions that challenge the agency.
Definitely. And he reiterates forcefully in the interview that the Shin Bet has caused so much damage to Israel, in his opinion. He goes so far as to say that its Jewish department, the section focused on Jewish extremists, or perhaps even the entire agency, should just be closed down.
Wow. And he presents a core argument against what he sees as the Shin Bet's fundamental philosophy regarding security, doesn't he? Especially when it comes to Arabs in dealing with terrorism.
Yes. He believes their entire approach is fundamentally flawed. He even points to the intelligence and operational failures leading up to the October 7th attacks as, for him, devastating evidence of this deep systemic flaw.
And what is that flaw, in his view? How does he see their approach?
He explains his view that the Shin Bet mistakenly sees Arabs, or at least certain Palestinian factions, as a potential partner, that it believes problems should be solved with them through cooperation, negotiation, maybe economic incentives.
Which is in direct opposition to his belief.
That they should be recognized primarily as, in his word, an enemy who seeks to destroy Israel, and dealt with accordingly, with strength and deterrence.
And he asserts that the Shin Bet's focus on Jewish action, things like Jews going up to the Temple Mount or settlers confronting Palestinian laborers as the primary triggers for conflict, is simply wrong.
Right. He argues the volatility in the Middle East exists because, quote, Arabs decided to kill us, not primarily because of specific Jewish action, which he sees as the Shin Bet, often blaming the victim.
So he concludes that the Shin Bet's whole security concept, which he claims is the driving force behind much of Israel's policy, leads the country to disaster time after time.
Yeah, citing Oslo and Gush Katif again as his prime examples of this flawed concept in action. He suggests the agency's failures stem from its fantasies and a refusal to listen to the reality on the ground.
Especially the views of people like him.
Particularly the views of young settlers who, he says, face danger daily and have a different understanding of the conflict. He even makes a specific and quite startling claim of meeting a Shin Bet agent in prison who was allegedly involved in inciting minors in the Old City of Jerusalem. These are very serious accusations he levels against the agency's methods and overall philosophy.
Now, faith is clearly a central element in his perspective and identity. It comes up quite a bit, and he incorporates it into how he understands events in his.
Absolutely. He shares his interpretation of difficult events, including attacks on Israelis like those on October 7th, as potentially being part of a larger divine plan.
How so?
He sees them, perhaps, as incredibly painful but necessary events designed to awaken the Jewish, to shake them out of complacency. He even draws parallels to patterns he sees described in the biblical book of Judges, where periods of trouble led to repentance and renewal.
That's a powerful and for some maybe controversial lens through which to view such traumatic events. And he presents his view that the inherent strength of the Jewish people definitely exists.
Yeah, he points to the bravery of young Israelis in recent events as clear proof of that strength and spirit.
But the real gap, he believes, isn't in strength, but in their thinking.
Exactly. And a lack of courage, he feels, to speak certain truths, particularly truths related to Jewish identity, connection to the land, and the nature of the conflict, without being afraid of global opinion or what others might think.
And he states his belief that his community, the Hilltop Youth, has a crucial message to tell and tidings to share that can actually improve the world, not just Israel.
Right, suggesting that courage is the only missing ingredient for this message to spread effectively.
And he notes, interestingly, that these ideas originating from the Hilltop Youth are in fact reportedly spreading. He sees them influencing broader settlement practices now.
Yeah, leading towards more agricultural farms, more small outposts, a focus on expansion into open areas, which contrasts, as we said, with the earlier focus just on building within a settlement.
But he acknowledges that despite this perceived spread of ideas, the persecution, as he calls it, the arrests, the outpost removals, the constant presence of security agents continues unabated.
Yes. And he reiterates his view that the Shin Bet fundamentally doesn't understand the reality on the ground, and perhaps, he speculates, they don't understand or maybe even oppose the importance of faith.
Which he sees as a core element of his identity and strength.
Right. He even suggests, quite pointedly, that maybe the agency's struggle is ultimately against anyone who talks about God, because for his community, he says, God is the most important thing.
And he shares it as outward appearance. His beard, the payoff, the side curls worn by many religious Jewish men, a large kippah or skull cap, isn't some radical statement, but for him, just a simple, natural expression of his connection to God, Torah, and Hasidut. Jewish mysticism.
He describes it as a declaration of his intent to simply be a proud Jew. He specifically mentions his connection to the Hasidic teachings of Rabbi Yitzchak Ginsburg, whose ideas are influential in these circles, drawing on Shabbat Hasidut. And he notes the growing influence of Hasidut within religious Zionism more broadly, saying it started with his grandparents' generation.
But despite the national trauma of recent events, he laments that he feels the security system hasn't learned the right lesson in his...
Yeah, he claims they've only increased the persecution against his community since October 7th, unlike the general Israeli public, which he believes has awakened some of the reality speaking about. He sees a growing gap there. Moving to his time actually inside prison, under the administrative detention order, he provides some personal details about that experience.
What was that like for him?
Well, he explains that, perhaps unexpectedly, he found that the time allowed him to focus on things he hadn't made enough time for before, like intense religious learning. Yeah, he mentions finishing a whole tractate of Gemara, which is a major section of the Talmud, a key text in Jewish law and thought. He said it was something he had completed. He also dedicated significant time to prayer and closely knew.
So it sounds like he found a way to make the time productive, or at least meaningful for him, despite the obviously difficult circumstances.
It seems so. He also shares his reflections on encountering other prisoners, people he calls nationals.
What does he mean by that?
Individuals detained for actions that he believes were taken out of concern for the Jewish people or the land of Israel. This could include, in his view, some who might have taken the law into their own hands or acted in self-defense when they felt the system wasn't acting effectively.
He even discusses his view on the concept of revenge, which is obviously a loaded term.
He does, and his take is quite unconventional. He sees it not purely as a negative impulse, but as a natural need, and perhaps surprisingly to many, an important value, which he believes is actually endorsed by the Torah in certain context.
An important value. How does he justify that?
He argues it's necessary for true revival and growth after suffering losses, but clarifies that ideally it should be carried out systematically by the state and the military, not individuals acting alone.
Okay. And did he have anything to say about the prison service itself, the conditions?
Oh, yes. He offers a really harsh critique based on his 5 months inside. He calls the facilities a backyard and describes them generally as places of evil that lack any real form of rehabilitation.
He speaks of abuse.
Yes, talks about abuse and a severe lack of basic human rights within the system, concluding that these institutions are not advancing society in any positive way. But despite how bad it sounds, he says he was actually glad for the exposure, just to understand that reality of the prison system firsthand.
And there's that anecdote about his film, right?
Yeah, quite a moment. He shares watching the trailer for his film, The Shabak Knew, from his prison cell. He initially thought he would miss the premiere because he was still detained. But then he was released early, just before it, and was actually able to attend. Must have been quite surreal.
Definitely. And how did this whole experience affect his resolve? Is he stepping back?
Quite the opposite. He concludes the interview with a really firm commitment to continue his work, his activism, his filmmaking, making his voice heard despite the administrative detention experience. He says, absolutely, we must continue. The right owes it to itself. He feels a responsibility, even citing people who experienced Shin Bet actions decades ago who he feels demand it.
So he's not intimidated.
He states clearly that he is not afraid. He views his actions as his mission, plain and simple, even if it comes at a significant personal cost like detention.
And he ends this section with a kind of call for unity, doesn't he?
Yeah, a hope that other Jews, perhaps those who don't share his exact ideological or religious perspective, will wake up, recognize what he sees as a shared enemy and a shared mission for the Jewish people, and that ultimately they can all be together in facing the challenges ahead.
So there we have it. We've taken a pretty deep dive into the personal experience and the very strong views presented in this interview with Avraham Shapira, recounting his 5 months in administrative detention.
Yeah, we really heard a perspective that not only lays out a personal ordeal, which is compelling in itself, but also fundamentally challenges the actions, the effectiveness, and maybe even the core philosophy of a major state security agency, the Shin Bet.
Framing his detention quite explicitly as a tool of political persecution in his eyes, rather than purely a matter of national security.
Exactly. And we explored a viewpoint that really seeks to redefine core concepts like conflict, national identity, even the very meaning of charged phrases like violence and enemy.
All within the specific and often, incredibly volatile context of the land of Israel and the particular community he belongs to.
This source, I think, offers a powerful case study. It shows how deeply held ideological and religious beliefs, when combined with traumatic historical experiences like Amona for him and a strong sense of personal and communal mission, can profoundly shape an individual's view of their relationship with the state and its institutions.
Especially when those institutions are perceived as acting against that mission, rather than in support of it.
Precisely.
So, maybe consider this provocative thought as you mull over what we've discussed today. Based on the claims presented in this interview, how does the gap between a state security system's perceived mission, its definition of threats, how it thinks it should counter them?
and a segment of his population's deeply held beliefs, like a specific vision for the nature and future of the Jewish state. How does that gap create friction?
And perhaps more critically, what are the potential consequences for both the individual and the state when that friction leads to controversial processes like administrative detention, where security concerns clash so directly with principles of due process and transparency? Lots to think about there.
Definitely.